Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. We now move to the second keynote discussion of this, the second day of the ESPAS conference for 2018. It's on the future of the social sciences and their contribution to policy making. And I imagine that many people in the room today, like myself, were trained, if that's the right phrase, as social scientists when they did their university courses and degrees of various kinds. And as social scientists, we reflect upon the interaction between what we learned at university, the contribution which those disciplines continue to make, and the world of policy making. And as you know, there is increasing emphasis in many institutions of higher education on trying to build a closer and more effective interface between the worlds of academia and of practice. And nobody really is better placed to reflect upon this and to try to shape the public discussion than Professor Brigid LAFFAN. She's the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. She served as professor at University College Dublin, UCD, for many years and vice president of the university. She was the founding head of the Dublin European Institute at UCD and has played a very important role in the public debate in her own country about European Union membership, and I think contributed to the shift in attitudes which has occurred in recent years. She's the author or co-author of several important books in the literature of European integration, the finances of the European Union, Ireland and the European Union, Europe's Experimental Union, Rethinking Integration. She received from UACES a Lifetime Achievement Award for her contribution to European Union studies and a Theseus Award for outstanding research on European integration. And as I say, she stands at the center of the public debate about the role of social sciences. We had, if you recall, a couple of years ago, a similar intervention which I think marked the thinking of a lot of ESPAS participants by Professor József-Antall, who was then at the European University Institute, now once again at New York University. And I see this discussion today as very much a continuation of the themes which József-Antall raised on that occasion and which remain central to the world of policy making. Brigid.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's been a very inspiring and very interesting morning. An English 17th century poet, Robert Herrick, said in the 17th century, he said, "I sing of times transshifting." And at the time he was singing of that glorious revolution, that great upheaval in the governance of that country. And it's clear from our discussion today that we again live in a time transshifting. We hold the future of the planet in our hands, and we may in fact be capable of re-engineering or altering what it is to be human over the next 50 to 100 years. And so, because we live in such times of shift and shock, it's also important that we as scholars in our disciplines reflect on the capacity of the disciplines and not just the society to deal with the nature of the changes that we observe. The social sciences at their core are interested in the mechanisms of social change, social processes, the connection between individual behavior, individuals and collectives, and the way in which these are embedded in institutions and norms. Social science has always been interested also in social order and social disorder. And of course, we now live in a time where, as we heard this morning, of some fragility in our institutions. It's such a big topic that I will really only take 3 very quick cuts. And I'm very conscious that when I talk about the infobio revolution, that I'm not a specialist in science and technology, but I think it has such important implications, not just for society, but for the social sciences. So I begin with evidence-based policy making, I move to the info-biotech revolution and the social sciences, and then I will come back to the shifts and shocks of political order. So, beginning with evidence-based public policy. when Tony Blair drafted his manifesto for the 97 election, a very large chunk of it was devoted to something called evidence-based policymaking. To think that that's just 20 years ago, that Tony Blair wanted to take ideology out of politics to try to ensure that that politics was not polarized, but was more technocratic, more evidence-driven. And that's only 20 years ago. And what was Tony Blair interested in? I think he was driven by two things. He was driven by the fact that he needed to make the Labour Party electable again. So he needed to establish the credentials of Labour in government. But also, Tony Blair was a great reformist. And it's most unfortunate that the Tony Blair legacy has been destroyed by Iraq. And it was an enormous mistake, but he actually was a very reforming prime minister. And in fact, in terms of social good, produced a lot of very important policies and developments. The emphasis in evidence-based policy making is firstly on what works. What will actually lead one from problem to possible solution. Also, the emphasis on policy, on evidence, is the sense of those who fund research, the public purse, asking us as scholars to have a societal and social return as well. And more now we see that the idea of impact is built into research funding, both at European level, the Horizon 2020, but also a lot of other, for example, in the United Kingdom at the moment, scholars must always develop a number of impact case studies, whatever that might mean. So there is the sense in which if universities and institutes of higher education are funded by the public purse, then they must in fact contribute to the public good. And out of that evidence-based policy making stream in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was, and it still lives on in the governance toolkit of this institution, the EU, but also many governments, impact assessment, evaluation, international comparison, managing risk, testing policy ideas, and we live in a world of benchmarks and indicators, sinners and saints. We live in a world where numbers are used to drive public policy. Now, if I could, in terms of the models of the relationship between social science and public policy, I would like to just firstly argue that the idea that there is a direct linear relationship between knowledge and policy is very reductionist. It's far too instrumental, and it drains the policy process out of much of what goes on. That's not to say that knowledge is unimportant, but that we shouldn't expect as social scientists a direct line from knowledge to policy, for the very good reason that our knowledge is often contested. We have very different views and very different evidence. Secondly, politics can use knowledge as a power resource. It can use knowledge to in a sense, favor a preferred policy outcome as evidence. It can also use knowledge tactically to prevent certain policy options emerging, or it can be used, research can often be used by the political process in a very symbolic way. There is a problem, a politician has no idea what to do about it, but spend some public money and do some research on it, and then manage the process, or manage the political process. I would argue that the most powerful way in which not just the social sciences, but science in general influences public policy is through what Carl Weiss calls the Enlightenment model. In other words, the importance of ideas. In other words, we would not have, no matter how ineffective in terms of the challenge, but we would not have the attention in the public policy stream and in the political stream to climate change today unless climate scientists had done their work. We simply wouldn't. The evidence had to be compelling, had to be persuasive. The fact that it's probably not enough, is clearly not enough, is quite another matter. So another important area that I have observed emerging, in terms of traditional social welfare systems, they tended to have a model of the male breadwinner and then the male breadwinner who worked for until the age of 60, 65. As our societies have changed, much more attention has now been paid to the life cycle of individuals. And questions have been asked, at what stages in the life cycle do you need public interventions? And research on early childhood has been extremely important in targeting the crucial importance of the first 4 years of life. In other words, the pre-formal schooling life. Without that idea, without research, that simply wouldn't have happened. Equally, in terms of now, there's a lot of work being done on how we reform our welfare systems but maintain high levels of solidarity. And again, there's a lot of work being done now on social investment. Again, it's a contested idea. It's contested. Economists have very different views of this. Sociologists have very different views of this. But it is an important idea that comes from the world of research to the world of policy making and of politics. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of science and the social sciences in terms of the ideas of the way in which we view the world and how that manifests itself, how it shapes prevailing paradigms, how it shapes the way in which solutions are sought and problems identified. But of course, the social sciences and the policy-making process are two different autonomous spheres, working to two different logics. In the academy, we're interested in research, the importance of the research, the data, the inferences we can draw. The world of politics is urgent and it wants solutions now. So for us as social scientists, it's important to remember that the world of politics and public policy is very messy, it's very complex, and knowledge is just part of that world and often contested. And there are, for public policy systems, lots of pull and push factors. There are election promises, policy priorities, ministerial advice, external commitments, and value trade-offs. And we as social scientists, when we're citizens, we can engage in the debate in terms of the value trade-offs. But we have to accept that it's up to legitimate public authority to discuss, debate, and reach conclusions on what the trade-offs are, what are the public responsibilities, and how to manage the societal conflict. And I think you tend, and I often hear among colleagues, there's a sense in which, the political realm is full of these greedy, power-seeking individuals without respect for what is a very difficult life choice. To be at the beck and call of your society and to make big calls. They're called on to make very big calls on occasion. And so I think we need as social scientists to think in terms of that messy world and what are the ways in which we can engage in that with that messy world. I'm very briefly going to talk about two transformations: the transformation of knowledge and knowledge production, and the transformation of our politics and governance. In terms of the transformation, because I think I didn't go to the Web Summit this year, but I went to the Web Summit in 2017. And because the Web Summit organizers wanted to have political fora. And what struck me very forcibly was, as I walked through pavilion after pavilion after pavilion, was this is a world that I did not know. the level of cognitive dissonance I experienced as I went through this world that is the present and is becoming. But what also struck me was everyone there in those pavilions was under 45, and a lot of them under 40. And everyone talking about politics was over 55. And so there was this disjuncture between these two worlds, a generation who are part of the transformation, and then us who are talking about politics in a very different and very changing world. And of course, the transformation, it's technology, but it's the interaction and intersection of the bio and the info. Because with neuroscience, behavioral sciences, computational capacity, AI, nanobioinfo, all that we heard about this morning, this will have and is having transformative impacts on our society, and therefore social science needs to grapple with social change, social structure under these conditions. Now, I'm not going to, given that we heard in a much more compelling and elegant way than I ever could from Lord Rees this morning on the bio, I think I just want to say something about the infotech revolution for the social sciences, because it is now, for the first time ever, there's a dramatic reduction in the cost of obtaining, processing, storing, and transmitting information and data of all kinds. There are now so many new ways of gathering data. And so social science is data rich. Social scientists work on data, they draw inferences from data. But the infotech revolution has in a sense, will require social scientists to really be trained in how to handle big data. It offers enormous potential. But of course, we must watch the hype. Data is just what we make of it. More data, badly used, won't make for good science. But it opens up enormous possibilities for new questions and new areas of research. And just to give you some examples, there is an emerging field now there's an emerging field, it looks as if I'm going back. Yeah, it's... Yeah, on to the next one. Yeah. There's an emerging field in law called empirical legal studies. And that's based on the ability now to have millions of data points on court processes, prosecutions, sentencing, the behavior of judges, that in any legal system that has a centralized repository of the operation of their court system, be it criminal or commercial, you can now interrogate that data to know, and you have the entire population. It's not a sample, you have the entire population. So empirical legal lawyers tended not to engage significantly in empirical legal studies, but now big data will allow for that. I'm not sure that judges will necessarily want their behaviors to be scrutinized in quite the way that big data will allow. But that is one possibility. Another area which is extremely important in economic terms is that there are public repositories of all public procurement tenders. And they're simply published in unofficial websites. And now those can be interrogated and looking at patterns. Is there collusion? Who's getting the tenders? It could possibly expose corruption because you could see whether the number of firms, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I'm not sure that competition authorities can use this, but again, it can't use it unless its people are trained to interpret the data. And I'm a political scientist, and again, if you think about the parliamentary committees and parliamentary debates are all online now. And again, if we learn to interrogate those, then we can look at agenda setting, parliamentary time, attention within political processes, and all sorts of things like that. So for social science, the toolkit has changed. I probably am, I can avoid most of this because at my age I don't have to, but any early career scholar in the social sciences now must be trained in big data. They must be able to engage with computer scientists and data scientists. They must learn all the techniques, data web scraping, pattern recognition, text mining. But of course, all of that goes for nothing unless good questions are asked. So it's important that social scientists retain the capacity to ask good questions and make valid inference and draw valid inferences. But of course, data is also power. And it's a big issue for public policy in the world we live in. Who owns data, access to data, who can commercialize it? And it has an impact on trust in public policy. And for the traditionally, nation states and international organizations were the controllers of data. They were the collectors of statistics at the national, regional, and global level. Now, the data is predominantly in private hands. And so again, there's an imbalance between public power and private power, and a real challenge in terms of regulating it. So, on the issue of data and trust, I will look at what I call the second transformation, and that is the transformation in governance and politics in our world. The equilibrium of politics in both at domestic level in many countries and in the global order has been punctuated. The liberal order is in retreat. Multilateral institutions are struggling within the contemporary international system. And there's a big gap between the demand for governance, which is very clear. All morning, we talked and heard about those policy problems that require governing. The problem in today's world is not identifying the demand for governance, it's the capacity to supply it, is the real problem that we face. And I would argue that's both at the domestic level in many countries and at the regional and international level. So what's happening in domestic politics? And here, this is very broad brush, so forgive me for the sketch, but it's important. The infrastructure of politics is changing. The development of the nation state and democratization led to large political parties that had resources, members, and controlled access to power. They were institutionally strong, they were rooted in their societies, and they were aggregators of public preferences. What we see now is that political parties that we have today are not the parties of even 20 years ago. They're losing members, as have trade unions, but political parties are losing members, and party systems are very different. There was, when I was an undergraduate, I could write papers on frozen party systems. There are no frozen party systems in the world today. What we see is very high levels of fragmentation in party systems, and also changes in political behavior. Much more volatility in political behavior today than was normally the case. So politics is changing, the infrastructure is changing, but we've nothing to replace political parties with, because government requires political authority. It requires a government to emerge from competitive elections. What we're also seeing is it's much more difficult in the world today to actually get government programs agreed. In other words, it's much harder after elections to establish the coalition patterns that one would have expected in 3 weeks or whatever traditionally. So volatility. And then finally, new cleavages are emerging in our society. And those cleavages are, there is a material element. One of the things that worries me about political science today is far too much attention is being paid to identity politics. And yes, identity politics matter in the world we live in, but what's really important is to understand what is the intersection between identity politics and the material, in other words, the social. And so those new cleavages are evident across the democratic world. And one of the key variables, if someone tells, there's one variable that tells more about political behavior today than any other, and that's level of education. If you know someone's level of education, it's a good predictor of political behavior. But that means, again, that within our societies, there are pretty deep divisions. Then, if that wasn't, if new cleavages weren't enough, we also have had a degradation of political discourse and the civility of politics through polarization. And it's not accidental that in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year was post-truth. The use of that adjective has increased dramatically. Why? Because truth or its lack is now a resource in power battles in our contemporary world. And of course, truth, politics and truth were always in attention, but there's something quite different today, and that is the use of deliberate lies in political competition. And again, the famous red bus in the Brexit referendum mattered. And despite the fact that the Statistical Office of the United Kingdom said it was wrong, it really didn't matter. It captured a sufficient proportion of the electorate who were worried about the NHS and therefore voted to leave. And of course, in the United Kingdom, we have a pathological liar. And so it's very difficult to have reasoned and rational political debate about the big policy issues that we discussed this morning when you have this kind of discourse. We also, though, have to hold to account those institutions or organizations or businesses that help undermine this. Facebook knew from 2014 that the Russians were developing the capacity to interfere in elections and did nothing about it. And therefore, that also Cambridge Analytica was significant both in the US election and also in the Brexit referendum. The micro-targeting of individuals, the spreading of fake news, and of course the use by the Russians. Russia is now disruptive power in our world, and it is using the openness of our societies as part of its political game. So just to very quickly sum up, because this is, it's a very big field. Obviously, knowledge production has accelerated, and this poses new problems for public policy and new challenges for public policy in terms of regulation, law, and ethics. Also, it poses the challenge of making sure that these new capacities and technologies deliver more social good than social bad. There is, in our world, a very pressing demand for public policy at every level of aggregation, at the local, regional, national, and global. And it is trying to make sure that in the backlash against globalization, that we don't lose the global institutions and the regional institutions, because it was extremely difficult to craft those institutions, and I think it's really important that the European Union uses its power in the world to protect the multilateral order to the extent that it can when it's being challenged from within the mothership. And finally, humans, we need sense-making and we need stories about the world we live in. And it's really important, I think, that as social scientists, that we grapple with these changes, but that we also engage with our societies on those changes, because the change won't stop. And the question is, can the societies be adaptable? Do they have the capacity? And they're, at least in Europe, and I think we underestimate this, the European Union, one of the facets of the European Union that's very rarely identified is the fact that it was open to poor states. It didn't draw up the drawbridge with the rich core. It opened to states that were really, really much poorer. And it has acted as an engine of modernization in all of the poorer countries in Europe. And of course, if the claim would be that convergence is not good enough, it's not fast enough. But I think one only has to look at the contrast between Ukraine and Poland today, and one sees the importance of membership of the EU.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Brigid. I think that really unpacked so many of the issues that surround this interface of public policy and the social sciences. We are running a bit late, but Brigid, I think, is open to a couple of quick questions. Please make your remarks as succinct as possible. I'd like to take people who haven't previously asked a question in this process. Lady here, I think.
Thank you very much for that brilliant lecture. I have a question, and my question is related to social actors. So yes, you have mentioned that social sciences are making use of more and more data, but of course they also work with the publics or the social actors. And I would like to know, what do you think about the relationship between how social actors with non-expert knowledge, if you like, are influencing or being capable to influence policy making? Thank you.
That one, and I'll take one from down here. There's 4 different people competing, but I'm going to choose this gentleman here.
Hi, Steve Sanford, head of Foresight at the U.S. Government Accountability Office in Washington. You mentioned the changing infrastructure of politics and parties, and if you look at some of, for example, the experiment that Ireland did with the Citizens' Assembly recently, what are the implications of that on, say, the future of democracy and maybe at the national or even supranational level? Thanks.
Firstly, on the social actors, I mean, civil society is very vibrant, and civil society organizations mobilize at different levels. And in my experience, civil society organizations are very good at interacting with scholars and interacting with the university system and using it as a resource, using scholars as a resource. I think where academics must be careful is that advocacy. We've got to be very careful on crossing into the advocacy road. I think if you want to be an advocate, then you should be a civil society, represent yourself through civil society rather than the academy. But I mean, it's a fuzzy edge. It's a fuzzy edge. On the infrastructure of politics and the Irish experiment, I must say that is one of the most heartening things that I have seen in democratic politics in a long time. And its origins are very interesting. and I was part of it. During the crisis, and as we know, Ireland was on its knees, a group of us got together to say, well, never waste a good crisis. What can be done here? And we set up an organization called We the Citizens. And the purpose of this was to undertake a process of deliberative democracy around the country, ending in a citizens' parliament, in order to prove the concept to the government. So we got philanthropic funding. We held 8 regional assemblies, and then we had a parliament. And what was really interesting, and it relates to the engagement of experts in public policy as well, what we did was, on each topic, there were 4 experts, and they would engage with the public representatives in the civils from the society, and they would engage, be questioned on their arguments, and it was it was a real dialogue, and so it wasn't a parent-child communication. This is what needs to be done. And then the government in 2011 decided that they would run with this, and held a number of citizens' assemblies that have allowed Ireland deal with problems that it simply politically couldn't have dealt with. And it was an extraordinary process, but it was so deliberative. The Citizens' Assembly deliberated, then it went into a parliamentary committee where you had deliberation, and only then did the government go to the country. And I mean, both the abortion referendum and the marriage equality referendum were massive endorsements of societal change, but it required the deliberative process to allow individual voters to feel that they knew enough to be comfortable with their choice. And I contrast that with Brexit. Because, and I know that we had a discussion earlier on the demand for referendums. You should never, ever, ever have referendums in countries where the electorates don't understand them. They are very dangerous instruments if people are not used to using them. Also, you need to prepare them properly to make sure that there is a deliberative element. And again, Brexit was an accident waiting to happen. It was a prime minister who simply thought he could personally win this. No homework, no campaign of any kind. And of course, all Leave had to do was use the wonderful slogan, "Take back control," have the red bus up and down the country, and mobilize people to vote against something that is not in their own economic interest. The reality of Brexit is the United Kingdom will have less power and less control. So that's an example of a political process that went really badly wrong. And I'm not saying that the United Kingdom doesn't have a legitimate right to leave the EU. Of course it does. But the debate and the management of it after the debate, in a way, what it did was the United Kingdom has extremely strong democratic roots, but all of its strengths were exposed in this political process, particularly an adversarial political system, a winner takes all. The United Kingdom is not set up to handle what it's now trying to face, but it has to, obviously.
Well, on that note, I just adding a personal remark. I mean, I think the point that's made about the lack of preparation for the discussion was very well seen in the whole Irish dimension of this. I mean, hardly anybody was thinking during the course of the referendum about what the implications would be for the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and the implications of a potential hard border. And this seems to have come to as a shock, really, to a large part of the British political class when it then subsequently hit them in the face. On this note, I'd like to thank Brigid hugely for the leading the discussion on this and sharing her thoughts and insights on, I think, a very, very important aspect of public policy, namely how people who are working in the social sciences can contribute to that process and deepen our ability to try to get the right policy outcomes, the best policy outcomes. We're running about a quarter of an hour late, and therefore I would plead with you to come back at 2:15, which is when our afternoon session resumes. We're moving on to our second panel discussion, Global Power in 2030. We've got an excellent lineup.